At the private auction, billionaire Harrison Dorn mocked the maid's daughter. "Your mother polished my silver for 17 years. Did she teach you to count high enough to pour the right glass?" He held up the deed to a West End brownstone. "Beat me at chess and it's yours." Laughter spread. Lena walked to the crystal chessboard. 12 moves later, the soft click of a queen checkmating a king. She took the deed. Dorn could not speak. Lena was invisible, just another server. Harrison Dorn humiliated her as entertainment, then wagered the West End brownstone on a chess match. He didn't know she'd been playing since age 4, trained by a ghost from his own past. And this wasn't just a game. It was the opening move of a plan 5 years in the making. The West End brownstone wasn't just real estate. It was a wound passed down through 3 generations. Before the Dorn family ever claimed it, that house on Cheshire Street belonged to a black businessman named Elias Vance. He built his savings from a tailoring shop in 1922, bought the property in 1931, and raised his family there for 12 years. In 1943, a zoning ordinance backed by the city's old money families forced a sale under eminent domain. The payout was a fraction of the value. Elias died of a heart attack 6 months later. The house passed to the Dorn family through a shell corporation. Harrison Dorn's grandfather used it as a rental property for 6 decades, collecting income from black tenants who had no idea their landlord owned a house stolen from a man who looked exactly like them. Clara Vance knew. She was Elias' great-niece, and she had the paperwork to prove it. For 17 years, she polished silver in Harrison Dorn's main residence, dusted his crown molding, and folded his $1,000 sheets. She kept her head down, smiled when she was called the wrong name, and never once mentioned the brownstone. But she kept a leather-bound folder under her mattress with every document she could gather: tax records, inheritance records, the original deed with Elias' signature. And she told her daughter Lena everything, starting when the girl was old enough to understand the word stolen. Lena was 4 years old the first time her mother sat her down at a chessboard. It wasn't just a game. It was the language of control that men like Harrison Dorn believed they owned. Clara found a teacher in an unlikely place. Anton Dorn, Harrison's disgraced older brother, had been exiled from the family 20 years earlier for marrying a black woman. He lived in a modest apartment in Queens, bitter and broke, and more than willing to teach a gifted child anything that might humble his brother. For 5 years, Anton drilled Lena in endgame theory, positional sacrifice, and the quiet art of making an opponent believe they were winning until the trap snapped shut. Lena took jobs at catering companies that serviced Dorn's social circles. She learned his schedule, his moods, his predictable arrogance. She waited, and on the night of the private auction, she walked into that ballroom carrying a tray of champagne and a lifetime of preparation. Harrison Dorn didn't recognize the quiet server with her mother's eyes. He saw only an easy target. What he didn't see was the leather folder waiting in her locker, or the 5-year plan reaching its final square. The brownstone wasn't a wager. It was a repossession. And the ghost behind those 12 moves wasn't just Anton Dorn. It was Elias Vance himself, finally coming home. The ballroom fell into a silence so deep you could hear the champagne bubbles fizzing in 100 crystal flutes. Harrison Dorn's king lay on its side. Lena didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She lifted the deed from the table, smoothed it against her apron, and slid it into the pocket over her heart. "Thank you for the wager, Mr. Dorn," she said, her voice steady enough to carry. "My mother sends her regards." The room didn't breathe. 47 guests, every one of them old money and older prejudice, watched a server pocket a piece of prime West End property worth $2.3 million, and not one of them could form a sentence. Dorn's face went from shock to rage in half a heartbeat. He lunged forward, grabbing her wrist. "That wasn't a real game," he spat. "You cheated. You manipulated the board. Return the deed immediately or I will have you arrested for theft." Lena did not pull away. She looked at his hand on her wrist, then back at his eyes. "Is that what you tell your business partners when you lose a negotiation, sir? Because I have a witness." From the back of the room, a man in a gray suit stepped forward, holding up a phone. He was an investigative reporter for the city's largest paper, invited as a guest for an unflattering profile of Dorn's philanthropy. He had captured every move, every word, and Harrison Dorn's hand on a young black woman's wrist. The clip was online within the hour. By midnight, the city knew that the maid's daughter had outplayed a billionaire. But Harrison Dorn did not become rich by accepting defeat gracefully. By 6 the next morning, his legal team had already filed an emergency petition to void the wager, claiming Lena had engaged in fraudulent misrepresentation. Their argument was that she posed as a server to gain access, which constituted deception. His PR firm released a statement calling Lena a disgruntled domestic employee's relative and suggesting Clara Vance had been fired years ago for theft. It was a complete fabrication, but lies travel faster than truth, especially when they come wrapped in billionaire money. Clara Vance watched the news from her kitchen table, the leather folder open beside her. Her hands were trembling, not from fear but from the strain of holding a secret for 17 years. She had spent her youth on her feet in that man's house, smiling through insults, quietly gathering every scrap of proof that the brownstone he lorded over belonged to her family. And now, after all those years, the fight had moved from the shadows into the light. She phoned Lena, who was at a safe location with the deed. "Baby," Clara said, her voice hoarse, "he's going to throw everything at us. The lawyers, the newspapers, the judges he plays golf with. Are you ready for that?" Lena's reply was immediate. "I've been ready since the first time you showed me Elia's signature, Mama." The legal battle that followed was a mismatch on paper. Dorn's firm had 37 attorneys. Lena had a single pro bono lawyer named Marcus Webb, a 30-year-old civil rights attorney who had never handled a property case in his life. But Marcus had something the corporate team lacked: a deep, burning hatred for eminent domain abuse and a client who had every document on her side. The original deed, signed by Elias Vance in 1931, was pristine. The forced sale order from 1943, riddled with procedural errors, was the centerpiece. And a newly discovered affidavit from a former city clerk, written in 1947 but sealed for decades, confirmed that the eminent domain was executed under pressure from the Dorn family directly. But Dorn didn't just fight in court. He fought in the court of public opinion. He leaked the names of Lena's former employers to tabloids, trying to paint her as unstable. He sent private investigators to Brentwood Avenue, knocking on doors, intimidating neighbors. One evening, a brick sailed through Clara's living room window, a note wrapped around it: "Drop the case or lose more than a window." Lena didn't flinch. She called the reporter, the one who had been in the ballroom, and gave him the folder. The next morning, the front page carried the headline: "The Theft of a Legacy, How a Billionaire's Family Stole a Black Man's Brownstone in 1943. The story exploded. National outlets picked it up. Suddenly, Lena wasn't just a server who won a chess game. She was the face of a reckoning. The pressure shifted. Dorn's business partners started distancing themselves. A major investment firm pulled out of a deal. But in private, Dorn was plotting something far more dangerous. He had learned about Lena's chess coach, his own brother Anton, and he realized that the entire night, the entire wager had been a setup from the start. He summoned a detective with a specific task: find proof that Anton Dorn had conspired with Lena to defraud him. If he could prove collusion, the wager would be legally void and he could sue for damages. Lena, unaware of this new threat, was visiting the brownstone for the first time. The key turned and she stepped inside, expecting dust and neglect. Instead, she found a home frozen in time, still furnished with Elias Vance's original pieces, draped in sheets. In the back of a closet, she discovered a locked metal box. With a crowbar, she pried it open. Inside were letters, stock certificates, and a will that named Elias Vance not just as owner of the brownstone, but as the true owner of 3 other Dorn properties, all stolen in the same scheme. The Dorn fortune was built on theft, and the proof was in her hands. As she stood there, her phone buzzed. It was Marcus. "Lena, they found Anton. He's been arrested. They're holding him on fraud charges connected to your chess match. They're saying you two conspired to cheat Harrison Dorn out of his property." The battle had just detonated. And this time it wasn't just about a house. It was about the truth buried for 80 years and the family ready to bury it again. Anton Dorn sat in a holding cell at the precinct, his hands cuffed, his face a mask of calm. The detectives had him on conspiracy to commit fraud, claiming he had coached Lena specifically to manipulate Harrison into a wager. The charge was flimsy, but that didn't matter. The arrest was designed to rattle Lena, to make her think that if she pursued the brownstone, the people she loved would be crushed. Harrison had once told his brother that the Dorn family didn't just win, it erased opponents. Anton now realized he had become the first target in that erasure. Lena arrived at the precinct with Marcus Webb. She demanded to see Anton, but the front desk sergeant shook his head. "Federal hold," he said. "You can talk to the FBI liaison when he arrives tomorrow." Marcus pulled her aside, his voice low. "This is a stalling tactic. They know we have the will. They're trying to bury Anton so the trust in your case collapses. Without Anton, they can argue the chess match was a prearranged sting, void the wager, and the will becomes tainted fruit." Lena's jaw tightened. "Then we don't wait for the courts. We take this to the people." She went live from the courthouse steps, her phone streaming to 100,000 followers who had been tracking the story. She held up the metal box, the letters, the yellowed will. "This," she said, "is not just my family's legacy. It's proof that Harrison Dorn's entire fortune was built on the bones of black homeowners. 3 more properties stolen in 1943. I'm releasing every document online. Let the world judge." Within an hour, the hashtag Dorn Legacy was trending worldwide. The revelation shattered the carefully constructed image of Dorn Holdings. The 3 other properties were now prime commercial real estate, collectively worth over $400 million. The will showed that Elias Vance had been the rightful owner, and his descendants were entitled not just to the properties, but to nearly a century of back rent and damages. Harrison Dorn, watching from his penthouse, felt the ground shift beneath him. He had thought this was about one house. Now it was about his entire empire. But billionaires don't crumble quietly. Harrison called a crisis meeting with his board and his attorneys. Their strategy was twofold. First, destroy Anton's credibility by leaking old medical records suggesting he was mentally unstable, a lie that would take days to debunk, but just long enough to pollute the jury pool. Second, file a countersuit against Clara Vance for theft of confidential documents, claiming she had stolen the leather folder during her employment. The goal was to make Clara the villain, an opportunist maid who had plotted against her generous employer. The countersuit landed on Clara's doorstep like a grenade. She was served papers while standing in her garden, her hands still stained with soil. She read the accusations with a face that didn't change expression. "They calling me a thief," she said quietly to a neighbor. "I spent 17 years in that man's house, and he never once called me by my real name. Now he calls me a thief." The irony was not lost on anyone who knew her. But the lawsuit succeeded in one thing. It froze the civil case, postponing the brownstone hearing for months. With time against them, Lena turned to the reporter who had been in the ballroom, now a trusted ally. He published a second exposé, this one detailing the original 1943 eminent domain scheme with the clerk's affidavit, and more damningly, connecting Harrison Dorn's grandfather to a network of politicians who had orchestrated at least a dozen similar land grabs across the city. The story spread from local news to national, and then international. A documentary filmmaker approached Lena, wanting to tell the full story. Signs appeared in the West End. "Return the brownstone to the Vances." The groundswell was building, but Harrison still held the legal high ground. Then, the turn nobody expected. The FBI liaison, an agent named Renee Calder, arrived not to detain Anton, but to investigate Harrison Dorn. She had been watching the case since the brick through the window, and the recent release of the clerk's affidavit had triggered a federal inquiry into historical housing discrimination and fraud. Anton was released. Harrison Dorn was now the subject of a criminal probe. The arrest backfired so spectacularly that his legal team scrambled to withdraw the countersuit, but it was too late. Lena and Anton, reunited, stood on the steps of the brownstone. The crowd that had gathered was now a small army, holding signs, singing hymns. Lena held the will in one hand and the deed in the other. "We have one move left," Anton said, his voice tired but steady. The public opinion war is won, but the courts, that's a different chessboard. Harrison still has judges in his pocket. Lena looked at the crowd, then back at him. Then we bypass the courts. We call a city council vote. Eminent domain was a city crime. Let the city make it right. That night, she filed a petition with the city clerk demanding a public hearing on the restoration of the 4 properties. It required 15,000 signatures to be placed on the council agenda. She got 32,000 in 4 days. The mayor, facing his own re-election, was forced to respond. A hearing date was set. It would be a public reckoning, not just for the Dorn family, but for the entire system that had allowed the theft to stand for 8 decades. And Harrison Dorn, who had spent his life buying and selling access, now faced a battle where money couldn't buy the verdict. The question was, would he show up? And if he did, what would he say when faced with the truth in front of millions? The day of the city council hearing, the chamber was packed beyond capacity. Every seat filled, every aisle clogged with people holding signs, some of them descendants of families who had lost their homes in the same land grab that took Elias Vance's brownstone. Clara Vance sat in the front row, the leather folder on her lap, her hands still. Lena sat beside her, wearing her mother's favorite pin, a small silver dove. And across the aisle in a tailored gray suit, Harrison Dorn sat alone, his legal team fan behind him like a wall of money. The hearing began, and Marcus Webb laid out the case with surgical precision. He presented the original deed, the clerk's affidavit, the will, and the letters from the metal box. He displayed a map marking every property stolen in the 1943 scheme, a red stain spreading across the West End. Then he called Lena to speak. She stood, walked to the podium, and faced the council. Her voice did not waver. "I'm not here to ask for charity," she said. "I'm here to ask you to correct a mistake the city made 80 years ago. This brownstone, these properties, are not gifts. They were taken. And you have the power today to restore what was stolen, not just for my family, but for every family whose name is on this map." She held up the map, then placed it gently on the council's desk. The room was so quiet you could hear the ancient air conditioning groaning in the walls. Then Harrison Dorn rose. He adjusted his jacket, walked to the podium with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to power, and began with an apology. "I deeply regret the suffering my family's past may have caused." He paused, letting the word may hang. "But I am not my grandfather. The Dorn family has been a generous contributor to this city. The properties in question have been managed responsibly and have created jobs and housing. To simply hand them over would set a precedent that endangers every property owner whose chain of title reaches back more than a few decades." He smiled, a politician's smile. "Let us not replace one injustice with another." A murmur rippled through the room. He was good. He had framed himself as the victim of historical revisionism. But Lena had anticipated this. She asked the council for permission to play a recording. It was a phone call, time-stamped from 2 nights earlier, between Harrison Dorn and a council member who had been wearing a wire. In it, Dorn offered a campaign contribution of $500,000 if the council voted against the restoration. The council member on the tape declined, but the offer was clear. The gasps in the room were immediate. Dorn's face went white. He tried to speak, but the council chair gavelled him silent. The vote was unanimous. The 4 properties, including the West End brownstone, would be restored to the Vance family. The council also voted to establish a task force to investigate all similar eminent domain abuses from the same era, with a fund to compensate affected families. The room erupted. Clara Vance bowed her head, tears falling onto the leather folder she had held onto for 17 years. Harrison Dorn walked out of the chamber, but not before a young assistant from his own legal team intercepted him. She was a black woman, a junior associate who had been working all night on a side project no one had assigned her. She handed him a printed document. It was a shareholder petition, signed by over 60% of Dorn Holdings investors, demanding his immediate resignation as CEO. The leak of the phone call, combined with the federal investigation, had triggered a rebellion in the boardroom. He stared at the paper, then at her face. She didn't smile. She just said, "Clara Vance sends her regards." The same words Lena had said to him at the auction. 1 month later, the brownstone's front door opened for the first time in a generation. Clara and Lena walked through the rooms, touching the walls, peeling off the sheets that had covered Elias Vance's furniture. In the attic, they found something that had been missed, a child's wooden chessboard, hand-carved, with the initials EV burned into the back, and beneath it, a letter from Elias to his future descendants, dated 2 weeks before his fatal heart attack. "I do not know if you will ever read this," he wrote, "but I believe one day a Vance will set foot in this house again. When you do, remember that the game was never about the pieces. It was about the patience to wait for the right move." Lena placed the chessboard on the living room table, the same board where Elias had taught his own sons to play. And for the first time she cried, not from relief, but from the full, overwhelming weight of a promise fulfilled across 4 generations. The Dorn Empire did not survive the year. The federal probe expanded, uncovering a web of fraudulent land acquisitions spanning decades. Harrison Dorn pleaded guilty to bribery and fraud, receiving a reduced sentence in exchange for cooperation, but he was stripped of his wealth and his legacy. Anton Dorn, who had been the quiet architect behind Lena's triumph, was invited to the brownstone for dinner. He sat across from Clara, 2 people who had been bruised by the same family but had refused to break. They talked until midnight. And on a warm Sunday afternoon, Lena stood in the doorway of the brownstone, watching children from the neighborhood run past. One boy stopped and asked, "Is it true you won a house by playing chess?" She knelt down and said, "Not just a house, a home that was always ours, and I'll teach you how if you want." The boy's eyes lit up, because that's the thing about victories like this one. They're never just for the person who wins the game. They're for everyone who comes after, learning the moves. Somewhere right now, there's a person being told the game isn't for them, that their voice is too small, their background too modest, their name too unfamiliar for the rooms where power lives. Lena Vance heard that message every day of her life, dressed in a server's uniform, invisible among champagne flutes and old money. But she didn't just beat the billionaire at his own game. She rewrote the rules using a chessboard, a leather folder, and a patience passed down through 4 generations. The brownstone wasn't just a prize, it was a receipt, proof that what's stolen can be reclaimed and what silence can find its voice again. The thing you've been told to hide about yourself, the part of your story someone dismissed as weakness, what if that's the very thing that changes everything? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story moved you, send it to someone who needs to remember that the long game is still worth playing. Don't go anywhere. Another story is coming next week that I honestly cannot wait to tell you. Until then, may the truth always find the right square.